and welcome to episode 26 of the Unpacking Weight Science podcast called A Good Fit, Health at Every Size and Dietetics. I'm your host, Fiona Willer, weight-neutral professional development dietitian, academic and size acceptance advocate. Our learning goals today are to appreciate the scope of PhD research in terms of project size and design, develop an understanding of how a HAES framework relates to dietetic practice, and identify key components in health-oriented size acceptance approaches and their relationship with key HAES outcome measures. So, I started my PhD in 2012 and set out to answer the question of whether HAES, Health at Every Size, was a suitable framework for use in dietetic practice. I'd been using what I considered to be HAES framework in my private practice work for some time, but I wasn't really sure whether I was doing it right. I'd personally become aware of my own disordered eating, body image issues, and eating disorder during my time as a dietetics student a few years earlier, and I'd sought therapy. In my case, it was being a participant in an intervention trial using mindfulness training and practice for people with binge eating disorder that really propelled me along the road to recovery. That intervention did not aim to change weight, and the group sessions had loads of size diversity in them. We didn't talk about size acceptance as such, but we worked on self-kindness and self-compassion alongside developing mindfulness skills to become friends with our feelings and errant thoughts and not to get tangled up in them. And there was no weight-related expectations in the program either, which was great. So in my personal life, I'd found this way of doing things really, really amazing. But the intervention was run by a psychologist, and I wondered whether dietitians could get in on this self-acceptance action too. During my time as a student, I'd read If Not Dieting Then What? By Dr. Rick Kausman. It had been handed to me in my first year by one of the more senior dietetics students who I met through the Dietetic Students Association, because I'm pathologically addicted to getting myself into advocacy groups, I think. Anyway, she saw a kindred spirit in me and handed that book to me exactly when I most needed it. And she's still a dear friend now. And that book was followed by many others along the same vein. And even though I didn't find full recovery until years later, they really had set the wheels in motion back then. So, I found myself in 2012 starting off this huge PhD project to determine whether Health at Every Size was something that dietitians could integrate into their work. The core question, whether HAES is a suitable paradigm for dietitians to work in, hasn't really changed over that time, although I did have to change my study design a few times to overcome challenges I had along the way. And that's pretty typical for a PhD student, but you always assume that yours will be smooth sailing because of whatever. But trust me, every PhD student has bumps and hurdles that feel awful at the time. So here's what I ended up doing. 3 studies over 4 years, a cross-sectional study of the knowledge, attitudes and practices of dietitians who work with larger-bodied clients, a 6-month observational study of dietetic clients who were women with a general health or weight concern who fronted up to a dietitian on their own volition, and finally a large cross-sectional study of Australian adult community members about body attitudes and eating habits. So my first study was the dietitians one. I did that in 2015, and the criteria were dietitians who considered themselves to work in weight management and or with people with a BMI of more than 25. And then I categorised them into either HAES dietitians if they had accurate HAES knowledge, showed a strong preference for working within a HAES framework, and reported using that HAES or non-diet approach in their current practice. For weight loss dietitians, they had to show a strong preference for providing weight loss counselling and report that they currently use a weight loss counselling approach in their practice. And then for all those dietitians in the middle, Fiona Sutherland would call them the fence sitters, I categorised them as a mixed approach dietitian, which is of course weight-centric still, but it's less weight goal focused than the weight loss dietitians. I ended up with 420 or so dietitians, 342 from Australia, which is my population of interest for the PhD, and 317 of those who could be categorised into those 3 categories. I ended up with 96 weight loss dietitians, 58 HAES dietitians, and the remaining 163 were classed as mixed approach dietitians. So I looked at their attitudes towards HAES and non-diet approach practice by dietitians. I looked at their own levels of body dissatisfaction, flexible dietary restraint, self-compassion, weight controllability beliefs, and their own personal size-accepting lifestyle outlook. And I asked them to nominate which of a list of 19 dietetics relevant strategies like mindful eating or portion awareness or exercise goals that they prefer to use with their clients. So they could pick none of them or all of them, depending on whether they like to use them with the people that they work with. There's no great surprise that I found that dietitians were more likely to have positive attitudes towards the mode of practice that they preferred to use. I mean, that's like the least surprising thing. But what was interesting was that HAES dietitians felt much more strongly negative about weight loss counselling than weight loss dietitians felt about HAES. So about 85% of the dietitians, regardless of their favoured approach, had a positive attitude towards HAES counselling provided by a dietitian, and 86% thought that it was a professionally responsible framework for dietitians to provide nutritional counselling with. Only 54% had a positive attitude towards weight loss counselling. And overall, the HAES knowledge accuracy was pretty low, unfortunately, except by HAES dietitians, of course, but that was part of how I categorised them as HAES dietitians. So that's, again, not surprising. Also, interestingly, while 90% of HAES dietitians had accurate knowledge of the likelihood of long-term weight regain after intentional weight loss efforts, that is, that most people are back to pre-intervention weights by 3 to 5 years, only 32% of the weight loss dietitians knew that. 30% of the weight loss dietitians weren't sure about the answer, which is good. To be able to know your own areas of uncertainty is a really important skill for clinicians and researchers. But 38% of the weight loss dietitians thought that the statement was false, meaning that they're under the impression that when people come to a dietitian and lose weight with them, that weight tends to stay off rather than go back on. Those findings that I've talked about so far, of the dietitians and their attitudes towards HAES practice and weight loss practice, were published in the Journal of Nutrition and Dietetics in February 2019. I ended up concluding in that paper that non-HAES Australian dietitians tended to like the general idea of HAES practice at face value, but may be more reluctant to embrace it if their knowledge was more accurate. And this is similar to findings from focus groups of dietitians in the US and Canada who are suspicious that throwing out weight goals might ignore health or be considered neglectful dietetic practice. So from here on in, my findings so far only exist in my thesis and in some conference posters and conference oral presentations. I'll be writing everything up for publication once I've defended my thesis next month. The reason I haven't published as I went was because every time a paper was accepted for review, the comments would come back questioning the validity of HAES in dietetics rather than reviewing the research methods or write-up clarity. So in order to be strategic with this stuff, getting my final studies findings published next will pave the way for the other earlier studies to get a look in. So in the meantime, I need to finish this PhD before the uni kicks me out for taking so long. Okay, so we're actually really still on study 1, that's the dietitians. I also found that HAES dietitians were more likely to reflect the characteristics valued in HAES counselling. That is, they themselves had higher levels of flexible dietary restraint. That is, that they were more intuitive eaters than the weight loss dietitians. They had lower levels of body image distress and high levels of self-compassion than the weight loss dietitians. And they also had less confidence in the controllability of body weight and a more size-accepting lifestyle outlook for themselves. And from this, we can propose that either HAES practice offers a suitable mode of practice for dietitians who hold these characteristics in the first place, or that becoming a HAES dietitian could influence these characteristics in the dietitians. It's a cross-sectional study, so we can't really draw any conclusions either way, except that voluntarily choosing to be a HAES dietitian doesn't appear to negatively impact the well-being of the dietitians. Overall, the dietitians in the study, regardless of their practice preference, tended to have higher body satisfaction, flexible dietary restraint and self-compassion levels than the general population. And I think that's probably a reflection of the societal privileges afforded to mostly white, mostly thinner professional women. And the last thing that I looked at in that study was at the strategies that the dietitians recommended for their clients. Remember that list of 19 options. And it turns out that just about all dietitians love to use mindful eating, hunger fullness awareness, and exercise or movement goals. And presumably weight loss dietitians use these strategies to try to elicit an energy deficit, and HAES dietitians use them to try to strengthen their clients' relationship with their body and body cues. Weight loss dietitians also love to recommend portion awareness and those plate proportion guides, and HAES dietitians like recommending eating without distraction and dietary variety goals. HAES dietitians were also very unlikely to recommend meal replacements, avoid food lists, and measurement monitoring to their clients. Weight loss dietitians were more likely to throw the book at them, endorsing an average of 12 strategies each, compared with the HAES dietitians' 8. I think this is probably because the list was derived in part from dietetics textbooks that are overwhelmingly weight-centric. So there will be strategies that HAES dietitians use that weren't on the list, fodder for future post-PhD research for me, I guess. Okay, so now moving on to study 2. Study 2 was an observational study of people who visited dietitians in Australia with a general health or weight concern, people who identify as women. And so this was meant to be my massive study, my final PhD study. So I had these plans of recruiting a ton of dietitians and hundreds of dietetic clients. I needed 300 to 400 dietetic clients in order to be able to really convincingly have outcome measures that were statistically significant if they were going to be. But unfortunately, even though I recruited 70 dietitians, I only got 37 people in the study. So I think that was because it relied on the dietitian talking to their clients. I don't know whether that happened very much. But then the client who didn't have any loyalty to me, they may have had a little bit of loyalty to their dietitian, but the dietitian was designed so their dietitian would never find out whether they had participated or not. That was to reduce bias in the sample and to reduce the chances of them saying good things because they wanted to please their dietitian and say good things about them. But in any case, I think I shot myself in the foot by doing that because it meant that I didn't get a lot of enrollments. However, so at the first time point, I have 37 women there, and then 6 months later, I surveyed them again or invited them to do the follow-up survey, and at that time point I ended up with 20 people coming back to tell me about their experiences. It was anonymous in that their data was separate from their contact details, and I could link the first survey with the last survey to have a look at what changes had happened over time. And again, similarly to the dietitians, I was interested in the levels of flexible dietary restraint, so how intuitive an eater they were at the beginning and at the end, and whether dietetic counselling did anything for that. I was also interested now in dietary quality. So my overall, remember, I'm trying to establish whether HAES framework is appropriate in dietetic practice, and we're interested in eating habits. So I defined eating habits in the framework of dietetics as incorporating dietary quality, so that's dietary variety, or dietary diversity within the core food groups, basically the chances of being well nourished through the food that you eat, plus eating behaviour, and so that is the dietary restraint versus flexible dietary restraint. So does somebody eat for the purpose of weight control? Are they really rigid in those beliefs? Do they deny themselves? Are they afraid of eating? Are they emotional eaters? And so forth. And we know that flexible dietary restraint, or what we measure with the intuitive eating scale, is associated with much better mental health and well-being and less chance of eating disorder as well. So flexible dietary restraint is a good thing. So I defined those healthy eating habits as people with a larger degree of dietary quality, so they had a variety of foods from the core food groups. I wasn't interested in the foods that might be classified as junk food because they don't actually make a big difference in terms of morbidity and mortality. I wasn't really interested in quantifying energy intake either, because in a HAES framework, weight is kind of irrelevant. So healthy eating habits, dietary quality, and flexible dietary restraint. As well as those, in study 2, I had a look at their levels of self-compassion and their level of body dissatisfaction, because the key thing with HAES treatment is you're trying to work on that body dissatisfaction by encouraging somebody to give up dieting, to give up trying to purposefully change their body shape, and you're trying to switch their outlook to somebody who accepts themselves and their body shape as they are, recognises that they have value in the world anyway, and tries to set them up for a future where they're open to their body shape and appearance changing over time, and that it won't change their core sense of value of themselves. Okay, so study 2, dietetics clients at their initial visit within a few days of their first visit with a dietitian, and then followed up at 6 months. So what happened? Well, basically, I didn't get a lot of people, as I've already said, so I can't say things for sure. The changes to dietary quality using the Australian Recommended Food Score, which is basically like a tick and flick measure of dietary diversity within the core food group. So if you eat lots of different types of fruits and veg, you get a higher score than somebody who eats fewer types of fruits and veg every week. So I didn't find any statistically significant difference between their beginning scores and their end scores for dietary quality. Basically, this is that there weren't enough people. So I can't say for sure what happened. But with intuitive eating scale scores, I did find a big difference, and that had an effect size which was quite large. So looking at Cohen's d, which is a type of stat test, the Cohen's d was 1.31, which is huge. Usually we would consider a strong effect size at 0.5 and over. So it's sort of astronomically improved for intuitive eating scale. Also found statistically significant improvements in body image and in self-compassion as well. So that's kind of cool. A bit of a bummer that there was no change detected in dietary variety. But when I looked at the strategies that those dietitians had recommended to their patients, to their clients, they had overwhelmingly recommended a lifestyle approach. So I didn't really have any weight-centric people in there. The weight loss, people who were seeking weight loss didn't enroll in my study. So who knows what happened to them. So basically all of the people were size-accepting, lifestyle-oriented people, which is like a bummer that I don't have a comparison group, but also quite good that I've got a bit more insight into what happens with HAES consistent practice. So those improvements were related to the use of mindful eating strategies and hunger fullness strategies in their dietetics counselling that they received. So that is pretty cool, I reckon. And the other thing that makes it interesting is that I didn't get a change in dietary quality scores, but no one nominated that their dietitian had been recommending dietary variety goals or the sort of national guideline eating goals either. So it looks to me like in those first 6 months of visits, the dietitians focused on the eating behaviour side of things. They focused on getting those intuitive eating skills going and the body acceptance skills going, rather than focusing on sort of nutrition intake outcomes. And that is consistent with the guide. So it's consistent with what I wrote in the Non-Diet Approach Guidebook for Dietitians back in 2013. It's consistent with what the intuitive eating principles say, that gentle nutrition should come later rather than sooner. So perhaps we're seeing this. The other cool thing out of study 2 was that I asked the participants open-ended questions about whether their dietitian had given them the choice of weight-centric or weight-neutral counselling, and how they felt about that, and how they felt about the mode of counselling, whether it was a size-accepting lifestyle approach or whether it was a weight-centric approach, like how they felt about the kind of counselling that they received over that 6 months. And I mean, it's so cool because what we've got here is an insight into shared decision-making in dietetics counselling. So shared decision-making says, and it's a part of the evidence-based practice framework, shared decision-making says that clients should be have discussed with them all of the options that are open to them. And that after that discussion, clients should be given a chance to mull things over and think about what's right for them. And then when they nominate what they feel is right for them at the time, they should be provided with that option for them. So what we tend to do in dietetics, and this has been found in other studies, is that because we're so keen to perform our professionalism and our clinical judgment skills, that we might discuss some of the options that are open to people, but they tend to be within the paradigm that we prefer. So for weight-centric, you might discuss what kinds of different weight-centric strategies, but don't take a broader approach. And we tend to not give people very long to decide what they want, because we want to talk about it and then boom, make a decision, let's do something right now. So it's kind of our fixing reflex and our performative professionalism that's tripping us up. And I found that in study 2. I found that even though most of my people were clearly sort of HAES framework clients, that their dietitians had made the decision for them that they were going to have a lifestyle approach, and that they hadn't received very much time to think about it. Because remember, the first time that they participated was in the first few days after their first dietetics appointment, and they had a little bit of time to think about what the dietitian had offered them. But it was really clear that some of the dietitians hadn't given them a lot of choice. Now, some of the participants were quite happy with that, that they expressed surprise that the dietitian was different from what they had expected, but they were optimistic about this mode of practice and were willing to give it a try because it was different. And others expressed complete relief that they didn't have to diet anymore. So there was a range of sentiments expressed. I had one participant who clearly was there for nutrition education and weight loss advice, and she didn't change her mind through the 6 months. That's what she wanted. She was quite disappointed that the HAES dietitian didn't provide what she was after. So we need to keep in mind that we're going to have all of these types of clients attend. That weight focused client clearly is not ready for size acceptance, and giving it to her at a time when she's not ready and does not want it goes against evidence-based practice as well. So she really should have been referred out to a weight loss dietitian for the time being. So what else did I find? So at that 6-month mark, again, I asked them whether what the treatment that they'd received, the counselling that they'd received, was what they wanted or whether they found it useful. And those HAES clients did overwhelmingly find it useful. Some of them said that they found it hard, which was interesting and something that we also see in our private practice with clients. So they found it hard. Some found it really, really refreshing and again, expressed a sense of relief and optimism about doing it this way. So overall, study 2 established that size-accepting lifestyle approaches are really acceptable to dietetics clients, to some of them, not all of them. So what we can take away here is that if clients visit a dietitian for a general health concern or weight concern, that some of them will be interested in taking a size-accepting lifestyle approach and others won't, but we need to give them time to decide what they want to do by providing the range of options open to them. And also that if people are interested in that size-accepting lifestyle approach and the dietitian works with them on the skills of mindful eating and hunger fullness training, that it is likely that their levels of flexible dietary restraint will improve, and their body acceptance measures will improve. So their body dissatisfaction will go down. So we've shown that dietitians can be effective in that way. Don't have to be a psychologist or a counsellor to be able to enact that effect on clients, which is kind of rad, I think. And finally, my third study. So my study 3 was a massive survey of Australian adult community members, basically, because I hadn't had enough people in my second study to watch over that 6-month period in dietetics counselling environments. What I needed to do in order to get a little bit more insight into the effect that a size-accepting lifestyle approach has on people's eating habits, I went to a large community sample to have a look at the people who do this in real life without necessarily receiving dietetics counselling or counselling from anyone. So again, cross-sectional study, electronic, anonymous, And this time I was interested in men and women because it was going to be a big study, so I may as well have a look at both. And the reason I had only looked at women in study 2 was that I knew that they were a population of interest for this mode of practice, and it meant that there were fewer covariates for me to worry about in the statistical testing. But for study 3, I wanted to know everyone. So the inclusion criteria were that you just had to be 18 or older and living in Australia, and wanted to fill in a survey on you hadn't been institutionalised in the past week. So not in hospital, not in a sort of correctional facility or any other kind of place where you didn't have control over your food choices. Because I was going to ask about their dietary quality in the previous week, and really it needed to be foods that they had relatively large amount of choice over. So that was conducted last year, 2018. The survey was open for a couple of months. I used mostly social media recruitment, so Facebook ads, Twitter posts, Instagram. I set up an Instagram account for the study to use Instagram as a recruitment method as well. And the Facebook account for the study had some ads run through that I paid for through my stipend, and also the university threw in a few $100s to pay for Facebook advertising through the university's social media accounts. So because it was really important to me, like I'm someone who, my circles are quite size accepting, and I was worried that I wasn't going to get enough people who were weight centric. In the end, I should not have worried at all because I totally did. But at that time during recruitment, I wanted really to be able to get out of my own circles to spread the survey far and wide so that I didn't bias the sample, basically. So in the end, I ended up with 3,186 people who completed the survey. And that just blows my mind because I did work out at one point, how much time that constituted, how much human effort time that constituted, because it took about 25 minutes, this survey. A lot of time, basically. So I'm absolutely bowled over with gratitude for the people who donated their time to tell me about their body attitude and eating habits. So 3,186 people. I had 2,115 people who identified as women complete the survey, and 1,058 people who identified as men complete the survey. And it's really hard to get men into surveys about bodies. So again, I'm like really happy that I had so many, and having a third of your participants being male in a big open survey is also pretty cool. So as I said, they're all Australian. They had again a range of BMIs. In the sample, in terms of the people who identified as women, there were 53% of those who had a BMI greater than 25. And in terms of the men, there were almost 70% had a BMI greater than 75. So that's not dissimilar to the general population either. I had loads of people trying to lose weight and loads of people who were not trying to lose weight at the time. So I'll just have to get my data up here. Okay, so I had 852 women who were not dieting, 946 women who were dieting at the time of the survey, 339 men who were not dieting, and 492 men who were dieting at the time of the survey. And I did an analysis to see whether that made a difference to their outcomes. Turns out it doesn't matter whether you're dieting or non-dieting and a man in terms of your dietary quality. There was no difference in dietary quality. There was a difference in their intuitive eating scale scores. Non-dieting men had higher intuitive eating scale scores and higher body appreciation and higher self-compassion scores than dieting men. In women, the non-dieting did make a difference. So their dietary quality was statistically significantly higher than both groups of men and the dieting women. And also they had high levels of intuitive eating, self-compassion and body appreciation as well. 80% of the dieters or more had dieted previously. So this was not their first weight loss attempt, which again sort of shows or demonstrates that weight loss dieting is not a temporary one-time only pursuit. It's a lifelong pursuit. So we need to view these findings in the whole context of somebody's life. I looked at whether the recency of dieting made a difference to our key metrics of interest, and it did. So I categorized all of my humans into never dieters or recent dieters. So they had been weight loss dieting in the previous 12 months. Current dieters, so they were currently dieting at the time of the survey, and then people who were distant dieters, so they had dieted but not during the previous 12 months. So even though it's a cross-sectional survey and I'm not following humans over time, it can give a bit of insight into the whether there's an effect of recency with dieting. And I did find that effect. So I had loads of humans in each of those categories. And the people who had dieted more than 12 months ago were quite similar to the never dieters in terms of their dietary quality, in terms of their intuitive eating scale scores, in terms of their body acceptance, and in terms of their self-compassion. And but they had a higher disagreement with the controllability of body weight, and I should think that is through personal experience. The people who had the worst outcomes on all of those measures were the current dieters. So the poorest dietary quality scores were current dieters. The poorest intuitive eating scale scores were current dieters. The poorest body image scores were current dieters. And the poorest self-compassion scores were current dieters. So these people, when dieting, have suppressed levels of all of these things. But it looks like if you can stop dieting and shift to a weight neutral, size accepting, healthy lifestyle kind of outlook, that you can get back to what people who have never dieted get back to those levels within time. And that's really super exciting because it validates that health at every size practice, when we ask people to stop taking a weight focus, that they may then slowly transition back to the superior status of a never dieter in terms of all those metrics that we're interested in. So that's super cool. And then the last thing I did with them, they got a lot of statistical analysis on them. The last thing I was interested in looking at, remember, was that if we can pull out the people who currently have a size accepting, healthy lifestyle outlook in their lives spontaneously, if we pull them out, what are their levels of these things? So not just men and women dieters and non-dieters, but what about their focus? So one of the items that was in the survey was what was more personally important to them at the moment: achieving healthy habits or achieving healthy body, a healthy weight goal or something like that. They also had the option of saying, I don't know, and neither of those things are important to me right now. So I could really pull out who was doing that for health, their idea of health, because obviously that's pretty subjective too, but really the definition of health in a concrete sense is kind of irrelevant, because it's this idea of health, the health-driven motivator, that I'm interested in, because that will be different for everyone. And with health at every size, people get to decide for themselves what their perception of health is as well. So it's that perception that's important. So that's what I asked. I asked that we're looking at a health orientation or we're looking at a weight control orientation. Pull those out. So I used those categorizations, and then I looked at who was dieting and who was not dieting. And the people who were not currently dieting, whether to gain weight, lose weight, or control their weight, I classed as health-oriented non-dieters. So that's one of the major categories, and they're the people who I believe to be analogous with people who choose HAES outlook with the dietitian. They're my group of interest. And then the second categorization was people who were health-focused but also weight loss dieting. So I called them health-oriented dieters. And then the third category was weight-focused weight loss dieters, so weight-oriented dieters. So I ended up with these three groups: my HONs, my HODs, and my WODs. And that turned out to be the most interesting analysis division. So my health-oriented non-dieters, they're my HAES people, they came out on top with all of the outcomes of interest for the project. So they had the highest dietary quality scores. They had the highest body appreciation scores, the highest intuitive eating scale scores, the highest self-compassion scores, the strongest size-accepting lifestyle outlook, and they also had the lowest agreement with weight controllability beliefs. So that basically shows that if we are encouraging people either in dietetics counselling or through public health messaging around nutrition and about eating behaviour, that encouraging people to accept their size and to have a health outlook that does not involve weight control, that is related to positive behavioural outcomes. So that the premise of public health messaging that has dietary goals, like dietary variety goals, alongside weight control goals, which basically the Australian Dietary Guidelines does, like the first guideline says, control, like keep a healthy weight, which basically means if you're not, you need to lose weight, basically. So that premise, having those two together, they're assuming is related to healthier behaviours. But in my study, it isn't. The healthiest behaviours are related to size acceptance and a health outlook. So that's an interesting finding. But then when you look at the people who were sort of the fence sitters, people who are health focused but also dieting, those people tended to think that the dieting was a health behaviour in itself. But their levels of all the things were also lower than our health-oriented non-dieters. And then looking at our weight-oriented dieters, so that the people who would go to the gym just because the machine showed them that the calories were burning from their calorie allowance, basically, driven by weight. They're doing the things to control their weight rather than doing the things for health purposes. And if they are doing them for health purposes, it's because they believe that the weight is health in itself, that they're entangled these concepts in their minds. They had the lowest levels of all the things, had the lowest dietary quality. So rather than encouraging people to diet and thinking that their diets are going to be healthier because of it, that is not true. That's not what happens out in the community. It's related to much lower dietary quality than people who don't diet and who have a health outlook. And also, they had a terrifyingly high risk of a positive eating disorder screen. So I'll just grab those stats. So my health-oriented non-dieters, my HAES people, when I used the 2-question eating disorder screen, which is really practical to use if you're a clinician, the question is, does your body shape affect the way you feel about yourself? Yes, no. And are you satisfied with your eating habits? Yes, no. And so if they are not satisfied with their eating habits, and if their body appearance affects the way they feel about themselves, that is a positive screen for eating disorder risk, and they should go off and have a more comprehensive eating disorder assessment. So it's broad, but what I found with my health-oriented non-dieters, using that screening test, 20% of them tested as at risk of an eating disorder. With the health-oriented dieters, that middle group, 48% tested positively for at risk of eating disorder. And for the weight-oriented dieters, 70% returned a at-risk screen for an eating disorder. I also used the eating disorder screen questions out of the EAT26 scale, and that's a little bit more specific. So they look at extreme weight control behaviours like purging, laxative use, excessive exercise, etc. And so that's sort of more specific, and the more potentially more harmful physically behaviours to do with weight control. With the weight-oriented dieters, 49% of them tested positively for extreme weight control behaviours. 49%, half, and this is hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds of people in my survey said that they use extreme weight control behaviours to control their weight. It's awful. And then with my health-oriented dieters, that middle group, it was 32%. And then with health-oriented non-dieters, our HAES people, only 13% of them. Now that's still over 100 people, but only 13% of them were engaging in extreme weight control behaviours during the 6 months prior to the study. So, I mean, this stuff is so cool. I cannot wait to publish it. And I'm so glad I got to share it with you. Overall, it's really clear that health-oriented size-accepting frameworks are absolutely suitable for dietitians to adopt in their work, as long as they're doing so voluntarily and are clear about the paradigm they practice from on their marketing materials and are doing shared decision-making properly with their clients. And in fact, shared decision-making should be part of all dietetics consultations. All adults should be offered the option of not focusing on weight-based outcomes. And no matter what flavour of dietitian they attend for health or weight concern, clients should be provided with open and honest information about the short-term and long-term likely outcomes of weight-centric and weight-neutral options. And people, particularly women, with previous weight loss attempts, body image distress, or a history of disordered eating or an eating disorder should be recommended a HAES approach in the first instance, as they're most at risk of harm from a weight-centric approach and more likely to experience weight regain or dieting futility. These things need to be brought up by weight loss dietitians as well as HAES dietitians. If weight loss dietitians were better at letting clients know that their weight losses will probably be regained within a few years, better at eating disorder screening, and better at referring interested clients to HAES dietitians, there would not be nearly as much animosity from HAES dietitians about the way weight loss dietitians practice. As I've said many times before, HAES does not have to exist for weight loss service providers to need to clean up their own house. HAES providers literally exist because weight stigma and discrimination are a thing, and because weight loss services are ineffective for most and harmful for some. If bodies actually work the way weight loss providers expected them to, there would be no pushback at all. We are a creation of their own making. Their chickens have come home to roost, and we won't be going away anytime soon. And my research has shown that this is a legitimate, fantastic approach for people who desire it. So that's it for this episode. The supporting materials, which include the show notes, research links and self-test quiz, are available upfront for current subscribers, only $5 a month, bargain, or can be purchased in a bundle if you're catching up later. See unpackingweightscience.com for details. And next time, episode 27 is Weight Loss Before Joint Replacement Surgery, The Cutting Truth. I'm super excited to be able to take a dive into this research for you, as it's something that comes up constantly for people, both health professionals and people who own troublesome joints. I'm going to look at the things from the surgeon's perspective, the anaesthetist's perspective, the patient's perspective, and the allied health professional's perspective, and provide you with both the science and ideas for ways you can advocate for yourself and your clients to get the joint you need. Until next time, goodbye.